All right, so today we're diving into some pretty deep philosophical waters.
Mhm.
You know, we're going to be tackling Democritus.
Oh, great choice.
Yeah. Now he might not be a household name like a Socrates or a Plato,
Right.
but trust me, his ideas are just as mind blowing, and especially for a philosophy enthusiast like you, I think this deep dive this is going to be fascinating. We're going to uncover some really intriguing connections to modern thought. So to kick things off, have you ever heard of the laughing philosopher?
That was Democritus. And, even just the nickname itself, I think it gives you a little bit of a hint about just how different his approach to philosophy was. We often picture philosophers as these kind of brooding, serious figures, right?
Yeah.
Hunched over the dark. But Democritus, he really emphasized finding joy in understanding the world.
Huh. So not exactly the stereotypical image of a philosopher, hunched over ancient scroll.
Definitely not. And speaking of those ancient scrolls, that's where things get a little tricky with Democritus. He was from Abdera.
Okay.
Now, Abdera was not exactly known as a philosophical hub,
Yeah.
right? Not Athens.
Right.
And to add to the mystery, we only have fragments of his work remaining. So it's like we're piecing together this philosophical jigsaw puzzle.
A puzzle where the pieces are scattered across centuries.
Yeah.
So what can we actually glean from these fragments? What were Democritus's big ideas?
Well, his most radical contribution, and I think this is the one that's probably most well known, is the concept of atomism. He was building on the work of his teacher, a guy named Leucippus,
Okay.
and together they proposed that everything in the universe, everything, is made up of these tiny, indivisible particles called atoms.
Atoms. Okay. Yeah. That definitely rings a bell from high school science class. But, Democritus came up with this idea over 2,000 years before we had any way to actually see atoms. So how did he even begin to conceptualize something so small and so fundamental?
Well, he was grappling with the ideas of another philosopher, Parmenides.
Okay.
Now, Parmenides had this really, really strange idea that change is an illusion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which, it's a real head scratcher, right? Because it seems like change is a pretty fundamental part of our experience.
Yeah, telling someone that change is an illusion is kind of like telling them the sky isn't blue, It just doesn't compute.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It's so counterintuitive. But the thing is, Parmenides had some pretty compelling arguments, philosophical arguments, about how it's impossible for something to come from nothing.
Hmm.
And his ideas had a major impact on the philosophical landscape.
So how did Democritus deal with this change is an illusion problem?
Well, he along with other philosophers, people like Empedocles and Anaxagoras, they were all trying to figure out how can we explain change without saying something comes from nothing. And so they propose that there are actually these multiple unchanging substances,
Yeah.
and they kind of mix together in various ways to form everything we see.
Oh, so it's more like rearranging pre-existing ingredients than like conjuring something out of thin air.
Exactly, precisely. And for Democritus, those ingredients, those were atoms.
Okay.
Eternal, unchanging, differing only in shape and size. And these atoms, he thought, were in constant motion within an infinite void. So they're colliding, they're combining, they're creating everything that we perceive.
So even something dramatic like a volcanic eruption,
Yeah.
for Democritus, that's not creation. That's just atoms rearranging on a massive scale.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. And you have to remember, this was a radically different idea, completely different from the kind of prevailing philosophies of his time. Imagine no gods, no inherent purpose, kind of pulling the strings, just atoms in the void.
It's like he stripped away all the mythological layers and just presented this stark materialistic vision of the universe.
Exactly. And that void, it wasn't just empty space for Democritus. It was a fundamental concept just as real as the atoms themselves. In fact, he thought it was a prerequisite for motion and for change. Think about it. If there were no void, if there were no empty space, atoms would just be jammed together and nothing could move, nothing could shift, nothing could change.
Ah, so the void provides the room,
Right.
essentially, for atoms to maneuver,
Yeah.
to interact, to create the dynamic universe that we experience.
That's exactly how Democritus saw it. Void wasn't an absence, it was an essential ingredient. And, I always think it's so interesting because there are some really fascinating parallels to how we understand space in modern physics. We know now that atoms aren't truly indivisible.
Right.
They have subatomic particles, right?
Right.
But that fundamental idea of building blocks, I mean, Democritus was really onto something there.
Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to see why this guy is considered such a visionary. But if everything boils down to atoms and void, I mean, what about qualities, like color,
Yeah.
taste, smell? Where do those come from?
That's where Democritus gets, I think, really, really mind-bending. He had this famous saying. It's one of the only, complete sentences we have from him. By convention sweet, by convention bitter, but in reality atoms and void.
Whoa. Okay, yeah. Unpack that one for me.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty profound.
What he was doing there is he's drawing this really sharp line between our sensory experiences, the way we experience the world, and the true nature of reality, the way things actually are fundamentally. So, we experience things as sweet or bitter, hot or cold.
Yeah.
But for Democritus, these qualities, these weren't inherent to the atoms themselves. They were conventional, meaning that they arise from the interaction of atoms with our senses.
So, like the taste of honey, that's not actually in the honey itself.
Yeah.
It's created in the encounter between the honey's atoms and my taste buds.
Exactly. And that encounter, that interpretation, it can vary. Honey might taste bitter to someone who's ill, for instance, or, something as basic as the color of the sea. That changes depending on the light, right?
Yeah.
So what Democritus was suggesting is that the world we perceive, it's actually filtered. It's a kind of interpretation. It's not a direct, perfect reflection of the atomic reality underneath.
So essentially he's saying our senses are unreliable narrators.
In a way, yes. Yeah, you could say that. And, this idea that there's a distinction between how we perceive the world and how it actually is, this is fueled philosophical debate for centuries,
Mm.
It really makes you wonder, what is reality then? How much of what we experience is actually shaped by our senses, by our minds?
It's like he's pulled the rug out from under our everyday understanding of the world. So if our senses are deceptive, then what does that say about our understanding of ourselves? What about the soul? Did Democritus think that was made of atoms too?
He did. And this is where his materialism takes another bold leap. He believed that the soul was made of fire atoms.
Fire atoms.
Yeah.
Interesting choice. What led him to that conclusion?
Well, he associated fire with life, right? And with heat.
Yeah.
And fire atoms, he thought, being so small and so fast-moving, they just seemed like the perfect candidates to explain the soul's abilities to move and to think.
So all our thoughts, our feelings, our entire inner world, for Democritus, it was all just the interplay of these tiny fiery atoms.
That seems to be the implication, and it raises some pretty profound questions about the nature of consciousness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If the soul is material, if it's made of atoms, what happens to it when we die?
Yeah. If everything is just atoms and atoms are eternal, does that mean that some part of us lives on? Or does the soul, kind of like a flame, just simply extinguish?
Well, that's a question that, scholars are still debating to this day based on the fragments that we have. Some believe that Democritus thought the soul actually dissolved with the body, which, again, that's a pretty radical concept for his time.
Yeah.
And it really forces us to think about, to consider what it means to have a soul, what it means to be conscious. Is it something separate from our physical existence, or is it inseparable from those fire atoms?
It definitely challenges a lot of our assumptions about life and death and the nature of being. So we have this philosopher who sees the universe as this grand, mechanistic dance of atoms, who says our senses can't be trusted, and who thinks even our souls are made of these tiny fundamental particles. You'd think he'd be a pretty gloomy guy, right?
That's actually what makes Democritus so intriguing. Remember his nickname, the Laughing Philosopher?
Right.
He wasn't advocating for a life of despair or, nihilism. He championed a life of euthymia.
Euthymia. Okay, that's not a word you hear every day. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's often translated as cheerfulness or tranquility. But
Yeah.
for Democritus, it was more than just, kind of fleeting happiness. It was a state of inner peace and contentment that came from understanding the true nature of reality and living in harmony with it.
So not just seeking fleeting pleasure, but a deeper sense of well-being rooted in understanding.
Exactly. He believed this inner peace could be achieved through moderation, through rationality, and kind of a detachment from the constant fluctuations of fortune.
It almost sounds like a precursor to Stoic philosophy.
There are definitely some parallels there, yeah. And it's interesting how Democritus, despite this very firm belief in materialism, he still recognized the importance of cultivating inner virtues and living a life guided by reason.
It's a powerful reminder that a materialistic worldview doesn't have to be inherently nihilistic or devoid of meaning.
Exactly. In fact, Democritus saw his atomism as a very liberating philosophy. He thought that by understanding that the universe is governed by natural laws, we could free ourselves from fear and from superstition.
So rather than being bound by supernatural forces or like a predetermined fate, we have the power to shape our own lives through reason and understanding.
Exactly. We can take control of our lives and strive to achieve this state of inner peace, regardless of the external circumstances that we face.
That's a pretty potent message even today, you know. It's like he's saying, don't let the chaos of the world dictate your inner state, you know.
Mm.
Focus on what you can control.
Right.
Your own thoughts, your actions, your responses.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a certain beauty, I think, in the simplicity of his ethical framework. It's not about adhering to this rigid set of rules or dogmas. It's about living in harmony with nature, both the nature of the universe and our own human nature.
Finding that equilibrium between our inner world and the outer world.
Exactly,
Yeah.
precisely. And it's a balance that, it remains incredibly relevant today as we navigate a world that can often feel very chaotic and very overwhelming.
Yeah. It's a good reminder, I think, to step back from all the noise and the frenzy and just, appreciate the simple things in life and cultivate that sense of inner peace.
It is, and it's a real testament to the lasting wisdom of Democritus, the laughing philosopher who discovered joy and meaning in a world composed of atoms and void.
Well, I think it's safe to say we've only just scratched the surface of Democritus's philosophical universe.
Oh yeah, we definitely have. There's so much more to uncover.
And that's exactly what we'll do in part 2 of our deep dive. So stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the philosophy of Democritus. Before the break, we were talking about how much his ideas, especially that idea of atomism, how much they anticipated modern science.
Yeah, it's really mind-blowing to me how he landed on that concept of atoms, centuries before we had any way to prove that they actually existed.
Right. It really is. And it makes you wonder about the nature of scientific discovery itself. Was Democritus just incredibly lucky, to just stumble upon an idea that turned out to be true? Or was there something deeper going on, some kind of intuition, some spark of genius that guided his thinking?
Hmm. That's a great question. Yeah, it's like asking, are great discoveries born from chance or from insight? What do you think?
I think it's probably a combination of both. There was definitely an element of luck involved. Democritus didn't have access to the scientific tools and methods that we have today. He
Yeah.
couldn't conduct experiments to test his hypotheses in the way that we can now.
Right, yeah. He was working with thought experiments, observations of the natural world, and philosophical reasoning.
Exactly. Yeah. But alongside that luck, I think there was also this remarkable intuition at play, this willingness to really question the conventional wisdom of his time and to explore ideas that seemed pretty radical. The prevailing view back then was that the universe was composed of these four elements:
Yeah.
earth, air, fire, and water.
Right, and these elements were thought to be, infinitely divisible.
Exactly. Yeah. So for Democritus to propose that matter was actually made up of these tiny indivisible particles, these atoms moving in a void. I mean, that was a huge leap of imagination. It required a completely different way of seeing the world. One that went beyond the limitations of our senses.
It's like he peered through the surface of reality and glimpsed the underlying atomic structure.
Exactly. And that's where I think intuition really played a crucial role. Democritus had this deep-seated intuition that there had to be some fundamental building blocks of matter. Something that couldn't be broken down any further. And he followed that intuition even though it led him to a conclusion that seemed, I think, counterintuitive to most people at the time.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary discoveries, they come from challenging assumptions and entertaining ideas that
Yeah.
that initially appear, strange or even absurd.
Absolutely. And this notion of intuition, I think, is often overlooked in discussions about science.
Hmm.
We tend to emphasize the empirical side of things, the experiments, the data collection, but intuition, that spark of insight that can illuminate new avenues of inquiry, I think that's just as vital.
Yeah, it's like the driving force behind the scientific process, the fuel that propels us toward new knowledge.
I couldn't agree more. Now, while Democritus's intuitions about the nature of reality, I mean, they were groundbreaking,
Hmm.
it's important to remember that he didn't get everything right.
Of course not. I mean,
Yeah.
he was working with the knowledge and tools that were available in his time. So, what were some of the areas where his ideas didn't quite align with our current understanding?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, he believed that atoms were truly indivisible.
Right.
And we now know that that's not the case. Atoms are composed of even smaller particles. You've got your protons, neutrons, and electrons.
Right.
And those particles, in turn, are made up of even more fundamental particles like quarks.
So he was on the right track, but he didn't have the
Sure.
full picture, obviously.
Precisely, yeah. Another area where his ideas differ from our current understanding is the nature of atomic motion. Democritus believed that atoms moved randomly in the void, just kind of colliding and clustering together by chance. But we now know that atomic motion is governed by very, very specific laws of physics, like quantum mechanics.
Right. It's not just atoms bouncing around haphazardly. There's order. There's structure. There are underlying laws that govern even the tiniest realms of the universe.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is where, Democritus's atomism kind of diverges from our modern scientific understanding. He didn't have the concept of forces or fields, which are so essential to our understanding of how particles interact.
So while he accurately identified the basic building blocks, he didn't really have the framework to explain how they interacted and formed the complex structures that we see.
Exactly. Yeah. But again, it's so crucial to keep in mind the historical context here. He was developing these ideas over 2,000 years ago without the benefit of centuries of scientific advancements.
Right, and the very act of even conceiving of atoms in the first place. I mean, that was a testament to his intellectual prowess and his imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah. And his ideas really did serve as this foundation for future generations of scientists and philosophers. He provided the first rough sketch of the atomic world, and
Yeah.
then later thinkers came along and they filled in the details and refined the picture.
Yeah. It's a fantastic example of how scientific knowledge is this cumulative endeavor,
Yeah.
building upon the insights of those who came before.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of building on insights, there's another fascinating aspect of Democritus's philosophy I think you should explore. His theory of perception. We touched on it briefly before, but it really deserves, I think, a deeper dive.
Okay, yeah, let's dive in. So, remind us what did Democritus have to say about how we perceive the world?
He believed that perception occurs through the interaction of atoms. More specifically, he proposed that objects constantly emit these thin films of atoms called idola.
Idola. Okay, that's a new one. What are those exactly?
Think of them like tiny copies or replicas of the object, composed of atoms that have kind of sloughed off of its surface. And these idola travel through the air and they enter our sense organs.
Okay.
And there they interact with the atoms of our soul, causing us to perceive the object.
So it's like we're perpetually surrounded by these invisible atomic ghosts of everything around us.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the way that these idols interact with our senses, this determines the qualities that we perceive. So, for instance, he believed that rough idola, these caused us to perceive things as bitter, while smooth idola caused us to perceive things as sweet.
It's remarkable how he attempted to explain those sensory experiences, in purely physical terms, connecting them back to the interaction of atoms.
He did, yeah, and it was a bold move, especially considering that most people at the time believed that qualities like color and taste, they were just inherent properties of objects themselves.
That Democritus was essentially saying, nope, it's all about the interplay of atoms.
Precisely. And there's a certain elegance, I think, to his theory. It provides this very simple, unified explanation for how we perceive all the diverse qualities of the world.
Yeah, I can see that, but it also feels, a bit simplistic, doesn't it? I mean, are we really just passive recipients of these atomic films? What about the role of our brains, in processing and interpreting all that sensory information?
That's a great point, and it does highlight, I think, one of the limitations of Democritus's theory. He didn't have a comprehensive understanding of the brain or the nervous system, so he couldn't fully account for all those complex processes that underpin perception.
Right. We now know that perception isn't simply about, atoms colliding. It involves intricate neural networks, electrical impulses, complex cognitive processes within the brain.
Exactly, yeah. But again, it's so important to appreciate how groundbreaking his ideas were for his time. He was one of the first to attempt this purely materialist explanation of perception. And his theory really laid the groundwork, I think, for later thinkers to develop, more nuanced and sophisticated models.
Like he planted the seed for the scientific study of perception, even though his own theory had its limitations.
Exactly. And even though his theory has been, superseded by by modern neuroscience, it still prompts us to consider, I think, some fascinating questions about the relationship between the physical world and our subjective experiences.
Such as it.
Well, if perception is just about atoms interacting with our sense organs, then how do we explain the qualia of our experiences? The subjective feeling of redness, the taste of sweetness, the scent of a rose. Where do those come from?
Right. If everything boils down to atoms and void, then how do we account for the richness and depth of our subjective experiences?
Precisely. It's a question that continues to intrigue and challenge, philosophers and scientists to this day. And it demonstrates how Democritus, even though he lived over 2,000 years ago, he was already grappling with some of the most, I think, fundamental questions about consciousness and the nature of reality.
Yeah, it's really incredible how much his ideas still resonate with us today.
It is, yeah. And it speaks to the enduring power of philosophical inquiry, to engage with these deep, timeless questions that lie at the heart of the human experience.
So, we've delved into Democritus's atomism and his theory of perception. What other facets of his philosophy are worth exploring?
Well, one particularly intriguing area is his ethics. As we mentioned earlier, he was known as the laughing philosopher because he really emphasized the importance of cheerfulness or euthymia.
Right, and that seems a bit paradoxical given his, rather stark materialist view of the world. If everything is just atoms and void, then why bother with ethics or happiness at all?
That's an excellent question. And it really gets, I think, to the heart of what makes Democritus such a fascinating figure. He managed to reconcile this seemingly bleak worldview with a very optimistic outlook on life.
So how did he achieve that?
Well, for Democritus, euthymia wasn't about chasing, fleeting pleasures or being swayed by external circumstances. It was about cultivating this deep inner peace and contentment that stemmed from understanding the true nature of reality and aligning our lives with it.
So it was about finding a wellspring of happiness within rather than seeking it in external sources.
Exactly. He believed that this inner peace could be achieved through moderation, through rationality, and a kind of detachment from the constant fluctuations of fortune.
It almost sounds like a precursor to Stoic philosophy.
There are definitely some parallels there, and it's interesting how Democritus, despite his firm belief in materialism, he still recognized the importance of cultivating, inner virtues and living a life guided by reason.
It's a powerful reminder that a materialistic worldview doesn't have to be inherently nihilistic or devoid of meaning.
Precisely. In fact, Democritus actually saw his atomism as a very liberating philosophy.
Yeah.
He thought that by understanding that the universe is governed by natural laws, we could free ourselves from fear and from superstition.
So rather than being bound by, supernatural forces or a predetermined fate, we have the power to shape our own lives through reason and understanding.
Exactly. We can take control of our lives and we can strive to achieve this state of inner peace, regardless of the external circumstances that we face.
That's a pertinent message even today.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, don't let the chaos of the world dictate your your inner state.
Yeah.
Focus on what you can control,
Yeah.
your own thoughts, your actions, your responses.
Exactly, exactly. And there's a certain beauty, I think, in the simplicity of his ethical framework. It's not about adhering to this rigid set of rules or dogmas. It's about living in harmony with nature, both the nature of the universe and our own, human nature.
Finding that equilibrium between our inner world and the outer world.
Precisely, yeah. And it's a balance that remains incredibly relevant, today as we navigate a world that can often feel very chaotic and very overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a valuable reminder to kind of step back from all the noise and the frenzy and, appreciate the simple things in life and cultivate that sense of inner peace.
Yeah. It is, and it's a real testament to the lasting wisdom of Democritus, the laughing philosopher who discovered joy and meaning in a world composed of atoms and void.
Well, this deep dive into Democritus's philosophy has been incredibly enlightening.
It has. It has. And it makes you wonder, how his ideas might apply to the specific challenges that we face today.
I was just thinking the same thing. For example, how might Democritus's philosophy inform our relationship with technology, which is, increasingly intertwined with our lives.
That's a great question. Remember, he believed that the world at its core is made up of these simple fundamental building blocks, right? Atoms and void.
Right. He stripped away the complexity and reduced everything to its most essential elements.
Exactly. And I think there's a valuable lesson there about not getting too caught up in the complexities and distractions of the material world, especially, in our technology-saturated era. Technology can be this powerful tool, but, it's crucial to remember that it is just a tool, right? It shouldn't define us or control our lives.
It's like he's reminding us to keep technology in its proper place.
Yeah.
To use it consciously, intentionally to enhance our lives rather than letting it dictate our thoughts or our behaviors, our values.
Precisely. We should be mindful of how we engage with technology, making sure that it serves our well-being and doesn't become a source of distraction or discontent.
That's a very timely reminder in our hyper-connected world.
It is. And there's another aspect of Democritus's philosophy that I believe is particularly relevant to the challenges that we face, I think, as a global society. His unwavering belief in the power of human reason and ingenuity.
Right. We talked earlier about how he viewed human progress as a direct result of our ability to adapt, to innovate, to solve problems.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's such a crucial message to remember, especially as we face these unprecedented global challenges like climate change, social injustice, political polarization. These are daunting challenges, but Democritus reminds us that we have the capacity within us to create a better future.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that while these challenges are daunting, we have the power within us to create a better future.
We do, but it's going to require us to work together, to think critically, to challenge the status quo, and to really harness our collective ingenuity to find innovative solutions.
It's like he's urging us to tap into that same spirit of inquiry and problem solving that led him to his groundbreaking discoveries.
Precisely. And I think Democritus, with his emphasis on reason, on moderation, on this naturalistic worldview, he offers us, I think, a very valuable philosophical framework for approaching these challenges.
It's a perspective that encourages us to face complex issues head on, relying on reason and collaboration rather than, succumbing to fear or resorting to simplistic solutions.
Exactly, yeah. It's about embracing this reasoned, balanced approach, recognizing that there are rarely easy answers and that progress often requires, careful deliberation and a willingness to consider multiple viewpoints.
Well, this has been such an incredibly rich exploration of Democritus's philosophy. It's amazing how much depth and wisdom we can find in these fragments of his work.
It is remarkable, and it makes you wonder what other treasures might lie hidden within his lost writings.
I know, right? We're just getting a glimpse into the vastness of his intellect.
It's tantalizing to imagine what other insights and perspectives might be waiting to be rediscovered.
Well, I think think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, yeah, we've explored his atomism, his views on perception, his very unique approach to ethics, and even touched on how his philosophy might apply to our modern world.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey through the mind of one of ancient Greece's most most revolutionary thinkers.
It certainly has, but before we conclude our deep dive, there's one more aspect of Democritus's thought that I think deserves our attention. His views on the development of human society.
Oh yes, I hoping we would get to that. We've discussed how his ideas kind of prefigured modern science, but he also had some interesting thoughts about how human societies evolved.
He did. And just like his atomism, his perspective on societal development was pretty unconventional. Remember how the Greek poet Hesiod, he described this golden age, this time when humans lived in a paradise of peace and abundance.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of a idyllic Garden of Eden scenario.
Exactly. Yeah. But Democritus, he actually rejected this notion of a pristine, idealized past. He believed that early humans, they lived this harsh, primitive existence closer to animals than the noble beings that are portrayed in Hesiod's poetry.
So no romanticized golden age for Democritus.
Not at all. No, he proposed this model of gradual development, a kind of slow and arduous climb from primitive beginnings. He believed that early humans existed in this state of nature, constantly facing hardship and struggling for survival.
It almost sounds like a proto-evolutionary view of human history.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
he saw this struggle for survival as the driving force behind the development of human culture and technology. He believed that humans formed communities for mutual aid and protection. They developed language to communicate more effectively. They invented tools and agriculture to ease their burdens and improve their lives.
So rather than starting in a state of grace and declining,
Yeah.
he envisioned humanity as gradually ascending from humble beginnings,
Hmm.
driven by necessity and ingenuity.
Precisely. Yeah. It's this narrative of resilience and innovation and adaptation in the face of adversity.
It's a far cry from the idyllic golden age that Hesiod depicted. For Democritus, human progress wasn't this divine gift, bestowed upon a bunch of chosen people. It was hard won. It was a testament to human creativity, adaptability, and the will to persevere.
Exactly, yeah, and I think there's a very powerful message in that perspective, a message that I think still resonates, today. We face challenges both individually and collectively, but we also possess this potential to overcome them through cooperation, through innovation, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
It's a reminder that progress isn't a given. It's a product of human effort and ingenuity. We have the power to shape our own destiny,
Yeah.
to learn from our past, and to create a better future.
Precisely, and that's why I think Democritus's views on human development are just as relevant today, as his ideas about atoms or perception.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful exploration of Democritus's philosophy. It's
Yeah.
remarkable how much depth and richness we can find in the fragments of his work.
It is. It is remarkable. It makes you wonder what other insights we might, glean if his complete works had survived.
I know, right? It's like we're only getting a glimpse of his genius.
It's both inspiring and frustrating to consider the vast body of knowledge that's been lost to time. But even in these, fragments, we can see the brilliance and originality of his thought.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's time for us to take a quick pause. We'll be back soon with the final part of our deep dive into the extraordinary world of Democritus. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Democritus.
It's amazing to me how, as we've been exploring his ideas, his groundbreaking ideas about atoms and perception and ethics, and even the evolution of society, it's striking to me how much his ancient philosophy still resonates in our modern world.
Yeah, I completely agree. It really is remarkable how his ideas seem to transcend time,
Hmm.
offering these insights into the human condition that are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Yeah, I completely agree. And as we've been discussing his philosophy, I keep thinking about, how it might help us navigate some of the complex challenges that we face today. For instance, We live in a world that's increasingly dominated by technology, which brings, incredible opportunities, but also some really unique challenges.
That's such an important point. While technology has connected us in ways that were unimaginable even just a few decades ago, it's also created, new anxieties, new ways to feel disconnected from ourselves and from the world around us.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation and demands on our attention. It can be really difficult to find a sense of peace or grounding amidst all the noise.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think Democritus's emphasis on euthymia, on
Yeah.
cultivating that inner peace and contentment, that's more relevant now than ever, I think.
It's like he's offering us an antidote to the frenzy of modern life, a reminder that true happiness isn't found in this constant pursuit of external things, but in cultivating this sense of inner balance and tranquility.
Precisely. And his atomism, with its focus on those fundamental building blocks of reality,
Mm.
that can also provide, I think, a really helpful perspective on our relationship with technology.
Oh, how so?
Well, remember, Democritus believed that the world is ultimately composed of these simple, indivisible particles, atoms in the void.
Mm.
He saw through the apparent complexity of the world to the underlying simplicity of its structure.
So he's encouraging us not to get too caught up in the complexities and the distractions of the material world.
Exactly. Yeah. Technology can be this powerful tool, but we shouldn't allow it to define us or to control our lives. It's important to remember that it's just a tool, right? It's a means to an end. And we should use it consciously and intentionally to enhance our lives, not to detract from them.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder to keep technology in its proper place, to use it to support our well-being and connect us in meaningful ways, rather than letting it become a source of distraction or anxiety or discontent.
I couldn't agree more. And there's another aspect of Democritus's philosophy that I think is particularly relevant to the challenges that we face, I think, as a global society. His unwavering belief in the power of human reason and ingenuity.
Right, right. We discuss how he viewed human progress as a result of our unique capacity to adapt and to innovate and to overcome obstacles.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's such a crucial message to remember, especially as we confront these unprecedented global challenges like climate change, social injustice, political polarization.
Hmm.
These are daunting challenges, but Democritus, he reminds us that we have the potential within us to find solutions, to create a better future.
It's like he's urging us to tap into that same spirit of inquiry and problem solving that led him to his groundbreaking discoveries.
Yeah.
We need to approach these challenges with a sense of optimism, a belief in our collective ability to reason and to collaborate and innovate.
Precisely. And I think Democritus, with his emphasis on reason, on moderation, on this kind of naturalistic worldview, he offers us, I think, a very valuable philosophical framework for approaching these complex issues.
Yeah, it's a perspective that encourages us to face complex issues head on. Relying on reason and collaboration
Mm.
rather than succumbing to fear or resorting to simplistic solutions.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about embracing this kind of reasoned, balanced approach, recognizing that there are rarely easy answers and that progress often requires, careful deliberation, open-mindedness, a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging the complexities of the issues, embracing nuanced perspectives, understanding that progress often requires, careful deliberation and open-mindedness and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that there are rarely easy answers and that finding sustainable solutions requires, a commitment to reason, to dialogue and a shared sense of responsibility for the well-being of our planet and future generations.
Well, this has been such an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of Democritus. It's amazing how much his ancient philosophy can still offer us wisdom and guidance for navigating the complexities of our modern world.
It really has been a fascinating journey, and it does make you wonder, you know, what other treasures might lie hidden within those fragments of his lost works.
I know, right? It's tantalizing to think about the vast body of knowledge that's been lost to time. But even in these fragments, we can see the brilliance, the originality of his thought, and how his ideas continue to spark our curiosity and challenge our perspectives.
Yeah, his philosophy reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, the quest to understand ourselves and the universe, that's a timeless endeavor. And even though he lived centuries ago, his ideas have this remarkable ability to resonate across time and to offer these valuable insights into the human condition.
Yeah, it's a testament to the enduring power of philosophy to engage with those fundamental questions that have captivated thinkers for millennia.
It is, and it leaves us, I think, with a sense of wonder, a desire to continue exploring these questions and to approach the world with this spirit of curiosity and critical thinking and a commitment to finding, joy and meaning in our journey.
So to all you philosophy enthusiasts out there, we encourage you to delve deeper into the fascinating worlds of Democritus.
Yeah.
You might be surprised by how much his ancient wisdom speaks to our modern lives.
And as you explore his ideas, remember the words of the laughing philosopher himself, who believed that the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is a path to joy, to tranquility, and to a deeper appreciation for the wonders of the universe.
Keep laughing, keep thinking, and keep exploring the rich tapestry of philosophical thought. Until next time on The Deep Dive.